My name is Femi. My pronouns are she and her. And I am a training consultant with NC Block. And I will also kind of wearing two hats this afternoon. We'll be giving a fundamental webinar/workshop on the history of policing in the prison industrial complex. And I'll give you more information about that after our other partners have a chance to introduce themselves. So Felicia, as you've probably seen on our promo, this is a collaboration between NC Block and NC Span. And so I want to give time for Felicia from NC Span to introduce herself and say how this came about.
Sure. Hey, folks. This is Felicia Arriaga, and NC SPAN, or the North Carolina Statewide Police Accountability Network, has been around for a few years, and most of the time we focus on providing support for groups across the state who are doing rapid response work when it comes to police accountability work, providing support in the form of capacity building for organizations or collectives who are also doing this, and also doing research, so gathering data and information that is able to support the various campaigns that folks are running on the ground. So we're excited to be doing this with folks, and so throughout the series, these 8 sort of sessions that we'll be having, you'll be hearing from a lot of our folks who have been part of the network for a long time, and that'll be a combination of folks who are doing different kinds of work when it comes to, say, pushing for civilian review boards at the local level, but also some of our groups who have been recently more active in thinking about defunding the police as well. So we're excited to be doing this. We're excited to have a bunch of our partners be some of the panelists and discussants as we move throughout this series. But I will also drop into the chat our information. We have a new website with some of our information too, where you can contact us and we'll be able to get back to you. And one of the things that we asked in the registration form is whether or not you would like to be plugged into local work. So we're also excited to be connecting y'all to a lot of the great work that's been going on throughout the state for the past few years as well. So I will pass it back to Femi.
Thank you, Felicia. I appreciate you. And also from a representative from our other partner, NC Block. Did Blue want to say anything?
Peace, I can. My name is Blue. I use they, them pronouns. I am the program director for the North Carolina Black Leadership and Organizing Collective, otherwise known as NC Block. We're a program of Blueprint North Carolina. We've been around since 2016, and our goal is to create and build a statewide network of politically active Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations who are dedicated to addressing anti-Blackness and self-governance. Yeah, and welcome to our training series.
Thank you, Blue. So without further ado, I'll jump right in. We are well into our time. Wrong thing. But to say a little bit about this presentation, it is a reflection of, so I'm a part of Black Youth Project 100. And if you have seen around the social medias, there has been a kind of a multifaceted study group that has been, that's being passed around our movements, that Critical Resistance, a group called Critical Resistance has formulated. And it's called New to Abolition. And it works as like a study guide. And if you've seen it, it is broken up into 6 pieces or 6 sections that kind of go in depth about policing and why one should consider abolition. Well, we will be facilitating that study guide as many organizations are doing across the country. And so I also want to uplift Critical Resistance, whose material is kind of the body of this presentation. And I also invite y'all, and we'll make sure that folks have the information that if you are Black and live in a triangle, then we will be elaborating upon this information. But I hope that we have a fruitful experience. I hope to cultivate a space in which can be engaging. Admittedly, for me, it's a little weird not to see people's faces, but I hope that we can make this engaging through the chat. So I really encourage you to utilize the chat, and we'll make sure that that is accommodating to our interpreters as well. And find, and we'll find innovative ways to hold conversation. Yeah, we'll find innovative ways to hold conversation. So just for, so we have just a quick, grounding in how we're going to spend our time together. You may be exposed to some information that may challenge you, that may be something new that you've never heard before, or you may be sharing space with somebody in which this is new information to them, etc. And in both of those instances, it's going to be open to struggle and includes accepting non-closure. So what that means is that there is so much that can be said about the history of policing. There's so much to be said about the prison industrial complex. And I know for sure that we will only touch the iceberg of it, but I hope that this place can be, or this experience can be, a point of encouragement and motivation to carry on your study and your scheming and dreaming past this webinar. Be your whole self. Come in with confusion, come in with curious and excited, or maybe not, depending on what else is going on in your life, but come as your whole self and receive your study in the best way that sees fit. Share space, that still can be applicable in a virtual setting. Just make sure that everybody feels affirmed in what they have to say. And critique to create. When we critique and struggle with each other, it is for the sake of our liberation. And to be generative and forward moving. And trust me, one thing I can promise, if I can't promise anything, is they'll be fruitful, that you'll get something out of it. Whether it goes the way you thought it would go, or you didn't get what you thought you would get. So just trust me, trust my facilitation support. I would say, there's interpreters, and my colleagues, Felicia and Blue, that this will be a rewarding experience that you're able to build off of. So, defining policing. And as I said before, a lot of these definitions and things are pulled from Critical Resistance. I want to try to make sure that I drop that study guide, or maybe somebody can just drop that study guide in the chat for folks who may not be aware of it, or if you've seen it floating around, to put it back on the forefront of your plate. But defining policing. And so Critical Resistance defines policing as a social relationship made up of a set of practices that are empowered by the state to enforce law and social control through the use of force. Right, so there are about three main parts to this definition. And that is made up of a set of practices. And we know that those set of practices are forever changing, are nuanced, are complex, that those practices shape and wrap around us in different ways depending on how we walk through the world. And that this is, and secondly, empowered by the state to enforce. So we know that that the state has different powers and stronger powers than us as, just individual civilians have in our day-to-day, and the ways in which those powers show up in different power structures, and who's able to engage in those power structures, of course, depend on who you are. And how is that power embodied? And that is through force. And that force, we know, looks a multitude of ways. So when you kind of think of those three components of the definition of policing, I invite you to think about and engage with me in the chat around how does policing show up in your life? And that can be so many different ways, you know, from maybe you have very close, you know, complicated relationship with the police. Maybe there's some of your family members, you know, maybe you find that when you reflect, you don't have much contact with the police. That's also how they show up in your life. So thinking day to day, when you think about the police, how do the police, and how does policing, the act of policing, show up in your life? And then what is your relationship to policing, right? So not only does it how it show up, what is your relationship? How does it make you feel? How would you describe that relationship? And so, yeah, I'll definitely share along with folks, but wondering how it looks to you. Trying to. Oh, thank y'all so much for sharing. So, you know, kind of like echoing what I said, folks said they have an uncle who is retired from the NYPD, and makes for some hard situations, you know, maybe some hard interpersonal experiences. Thank you, Louise. Felicia says, things like coffee with the cops trying to show that they are our friends. So, you know, yes, touch on those nuances. Thank you so much, right? With like coffee with the cops, with National Night Out, kind of like these cultural programs to kind of be facades and to just kind of straight up lie about the police force's relationship with these communities, and also kind of conflate those cultural initiatives with any type of systemic change. Thanks, Felicia. College campuses. I haven't had much interaction with the police other than being pulled over for my lights being off on my car. There was one police officer in my high school who was nice. Right. And thank you for bringing in those complexities, because that can be, you know, the webs, and we'll talk a lot about this theme of webs in our time together, but that can be the complexity of the web of, like, you know, our individual experiences, which is totally valid. And also what is systematically happening and who it's happening to. Policing shows up in my life currently a lot when they are speeding over policing down the road I live on. A lot of times canvassing the community I work with in East Raleigh. Yeah, you know, I always say that no one speeds like the police. You know, speeding tickets is somehow most gives police infrastructure so much money, gives the state so much money. And every time I see the police, they're speeding. I read just one or two more, but thank y'all for being so participatory. Please keep it up for the remainder of our time together. And make sure that, you know, even if I'm not able to read them all out loud, that you read each other's. I don't have contact with the police. My relationship is one similar of an employee with a boss. You may not be doing anything wrong, but you certainly feel like if you are around, you are going to get in trouble. Oh, wow. That's such a good metaphor. That's such a good simile. Thank you for that. Right, and so just to uplift like the varying experiences that we are having in our day to day with this um, phenomenon that is policing. Um, and we also will get into like who gets to have what experiences, especially on average. Oh, this is a good nuance to bring in. I'll say this will be my last one I read out, but in visual interpretation, cops kneeling at protest 1 minute, then spraying protesters with tear gas the next. I haven't had bad interactions with the cops personally because I'm a light-skinned biracial Black woman. Again, bringing in those nuances and complexities. But I think that, the cops kneeling phenomenon. Oh, okay, thank you. I'll be sure to slow down. I think that the cops kneeling phenomenon kind of goes back into what we said earlier in our time around those cultural initiatives that the police try to inflate for actual systemic change. But thank you, and keep thinking about in our time together how policing shows up, and having a better and complex understanding of how it shows up in a multitude of ways that it can show up leads us to know how to really combat it for the long run. So, defining policing, kind of elaborated upon, but reinforcing the oppressive social and economic relationships that have been central to the US throughout its history. The roots of policing in the United States are closely linked to the capture of escaped slaves and the enforcement of Black codes. As social conditions change how policing is used to target poor people, people of color, immigrants, and others who do not conform on the street or in their homes also shifts over time. So the system of policing is one that adapts, it morphs and it changes due to everything from the demographic of inner cities to what laws have been amended, changed, to mass incarceration even, which heavily involves with policing, depending on what, is available, what society, however it is structured, policing, it changes and adapts and morphs to be its most successful, ultimately. And so, we want to talk about the origins of policing. And so, people have heard, and I won't assume people's knowledge, but it goes around often that the current structure of our police forces, that their origins are slave patrols, and that is true, most certainly. But even when we get kind of like in the midst of that too, which I think is important, because when we talk about the origins of police, we see how its origins, what its contributions was to society, what it prioritized as its work, is basically the same as how it functions, what it prioritizes now. How it functions maybe have, morphed and adapted. But we'll see that, the origins of police were to, catch enslaved people. And then when these people were no longer enslaved, to continue their disenfranchisement. So that's a main tier. Another main tier is the protection of property. you'll see that in the origins of, policing as we know it. And so, just to humor us just a little bit, and such a, possibly grim topic, some of the very first formations of law enforcement and social control organizations in the US were insufficient for-profit volunteer-based entities. Oftentimes men were required to do night watch. So there was this kind of structure that was basically from Europe, in which night watchers were kind of like the first structure of what it meant for like enforcing laws and social control. And as I just read, these were like for-profit, businesses essentially. There was just some type of structure for communities and towns to, enforce law in a general sense. So a lot of times, or also security. So a lot of these night watchers would, be in town, and they would basically watch over people who were drinking. They would watch over or, punish or, detain people who were performing sex work. But it was, basically just kind of some faulty security. And it was a thing that, lasted across some centuries, but it was also wildly ineffective because first of all, it had a stigma. People didn't want to do this job. That's something familiar from the current times. People didn't want to do this job. It was seen as like a chore, as something you had to do, especially in every town was respectively different. So in some towns, you would have, it was required for every man in town to register and to take up a duty or a shift of night watching. In some towns, it was like just volunteer based, but also, geared towards men. And in some towns, it was a form of punishment. So if you did something wrong, ironically, a thing that can be assigned to you is night watching. Or some towns had a mixture of all three. But it was a, insufficient structure that was often corrupt. And often people didn't take it seriously because of the stigma. And there was many documents of like people who did these jobs often being drunk on the job. So that's just a little, origins, like pre policing, and even in those rough early structures, you can see some similarities to the current time. And then we got people dropping some resources. Thank y'all. And so just to reiterate what I said, night watchers, some of their main focuses was protecting property of the rich, for security. So, and it was also very, very privileged. As again, you can see these days, like for instance, richer people used to hire night watchers or give night watchers extra money to like stand right in front of their house to protect them. And to enforce laws against social deviations such as gambling and sex work in places where, and in towns where it was more conservative, and there was no tolerance for that. But there's a difference, of course, regionally for, the origins of policing. And you have, kind of concentrating on the East Coast, because we are talking about like earlier colonialism. you have the North, in which their early structures of policing was very centered on protecting private property. And so, of course, Boston was a big shipping, a big shipping hub, especially in early colonial US. And that, being a big shipping hub, any big entity has ripple effects. So one of the ripple effects was like a culture of like stealing shipments, stealing property from around the area, because there was a lot of goods, a lot of material, a lot of things just coming in and out. So around that area, just breed a culture of stealing and lifting material from the areas that boats would dock. And so, and of course, from the history of humans who usually steals, especially in that way, poor people. And so Boston, ended up being one of the first places to have like an established police force as we know them in the early 19th century, mainly because of this dilemma that they were having. However, in the South, the main, economies, it was also about protecting and controlling property, but that property was enslaved Black people. And so you kind of see the origins of policing in the South kind of being centered in that. And the first formal slave patrol was recorded in the Carolina colonies, which here we are, for folks who are on the call from North Carolina, in 1704. Right, in 1704. And then, just thinking about the nuances of the South, during Reconstruction, many local sheriffs function in reflection of defunct slave patrols by enforcing segregation and the disenfranchisement of free Black people. And then during the during the Civil War, the military served as the main law enforcement. So that gets into what we'll get into a little bit later, of like the prison industrial complex and how you can see the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex already tangling themselves. So, yeah, I just want to take a breather and just say if anybody has anything, because I do believe that this, any space that is created, everyone's a leader. So I want to take the time to see if anybody has any questions, but also if anybody has anything to add to what I'm talking about in this moment. So it's like, yeah, and another thing, this also happened at the turn of the 18th century during those times. Or, yeah, this is also happening in the South around policing. This will take, a couple minutes for any questions or comments to be typed up in the chat before we switch centuries. No? Okay. And if anybody's typing, I'll stop and read later, but I'll move on for the sake of time. Okay. So the turn of the 19th century, the 1800s was basically what we know, after kind of like the first iterations of policing around like slave patrol and property control, property protection, like organizations. The more contemporary sense was really got its wings in the 19th century. And so the first like formal police forces was like Philly, was like New York, was like Boston, as I said, and was like Chicago, which I think is really important information when we think about the public discourse around the relationship that police have with community members in these certain areas. You know, you think of NYPD, you think of the Chicago Police Department, you think about, you know, the Philadelphia Police Department, and they have some of the most notable, you know, infamous and, you know, just downright violent relationship with their communities that have been kind of like in a public sphere for decades. And I don't think that that is a coincidence. And so some of these first, you know, formal police forces were started up north. And by the end of the 19th century, so when we get to like 1880s, every major city in the US as it stood at the time had a formalized police force. Okay. And even as early as the 1880s, Black people were a part of these police forces, which I find to be very complicated. And even, I believe, if I have it correct, the first you know, recorded Black person was in the 1870s, and he joined the Chicago Police Department. So you see, like, this entity really starts to formulate itself in the 19th century and then really take off, you know, after it's kind of grew, really take off running in the 20th century. And this, you know, we are probably more privy to the ways in which this has shown up in the 20th century. All throughout the 1900s, you know, this entity was strengthened. Its power was strengthened. And also the stigma, you know, the stigma was through cultural work, you know, law enforcement became people that you look up to, that you aspire to be, that's on career day. That's, you know, it was also like this professionalization of law enforcement that was also a big part of the 20th century. Because like, you know, as I said earlier, you know, the very early formations of this was not a popular, people did not want to do it. And often in my readings, when people were a part of the police forces in those earlier formations, people often hid it. People, you know, there were badges back then. People often did not wear their badges because of stigma, because it was not something people wanted to do. Like, oh, you telling on people, like, you know, hustling goods and like and gambling and like, you know, or like drinking in dry like cities or towns. Like, that's not, like, you're not cool for doing that. So I think that's interesting. It makes me think about the present day. But yeah, along with like kind of that cultural shift of policing aspiring as something that you want to do, as something that you want to work towards, to being like a familial thing. You know, there's a lot around policing and families that, you know, policing keeps your family safe. And then we're starting to formulate a culture where more and more often people's fathers and mothers and parents and people that they care about are more, there's a higher statistic that those people are going to be police, which also, you know, contributes to a cultural shift. And then you have all, you know, more that's even here, different like what I'm calling, like loosely calling, cultural and systematic campaigns, in which they give, you know, it further perpetuates the general narrative that police, maintain law and order, that they know what's right and wrong, and that whatever their actions that they take towards what they see and view as right and wrong is justifiable. So whatever use of force, whatever their reaction to your action is justifiable. And some of those things is Jim Crow, prohibition, McCarthyism, war on drugs, war on terrorism, and criminalized gayness and transness. And we can think about all the ways in which, these are just like, blickets, and then there's all the branches in which that really, makes Jim Crow happen, made McCarthyism happen, the war on terrorism that's still happening. So yeah, that's just like a general history of policing. Any thoughts that people want to share in the chat? There's a question. It says, what happened between 19th century and 20th century that changed the ways that people wanted to become police? So I'm guessing that you're asking, like, what was happening between like the 1800s and the 1900s that was that had people that wanted to be police, right? Kind of what I was talking on, like that cultural shift. I don't have all the answers, but from my reading, it was a lot of cultural work. It was a lot of, and also if we get the timeline in our head, as I said, at the end of the 19th century, so we're talking about 1860s on, is when, basically police forces really got established. What else was happening during that time? Black folks were being emancipated. And so, right. Share more about that, Mary, about your thoughts around industrialization, corporatization, as I kind of elaborate on my point. But I think it's very purposeful that there was basically an infrastructure that was rapidly building as the economy of enslaving Black people was crumbling. There was in the same century a rapid formalization of these police forces across the country, especially in this region, which we know from much evidence that basically their first goals, their first initiatives was basically to pick up the work of slave patrols. And so if it wasn't actually catching enslaved people because they were now, free, then it was disenfranchising them. It was make sure that what was defined as freedom was as limited as possible. Right, and we also have the 13th Amendment, which also, which is basically in the same, in the same general time span as what I'm talking about, of what basically made slavery illegal only if you were not a prisoner. And so now you have the kind of formalizing of what a prisoner is, what is punishable, that all leads to basically further, sorry, I'm reading the chat, further disenfranchising Black people. Profit and class demarcation heightened, and there was more incentive to protect property, limit people's movement, and control, protect access to wealth and property. Yes, So that kind of just elaborating, thank you for that, Mary, kind of elaborating on like that property piece that we were talking about earlier. I think that also, I also think that, I think like the Red Scare, going back into McCarthyism, has a lot to do with it too, even though it's a little later. Let's get into like the 40s. I think that, because I'm thinking about my readings around how early police formations was also used to scare and control and manipulate union workers. And so, as the industrialization came along and, I'm being so general, but, working conditions were inhumane and people were trying to, unionize themselves, and that, another prominent tactic of the early police formations was to basically disband those things before they even got any momentum. Right. Okay. Well, y'all saying some good stuff in there. A lot of people uplifting the 13th Amendment, which was definitely a big continuation. Okay. So, I'm gonna check my time. Cool. Have about 20 minutes left. So, for talking about, and the chat is our space. You can definitely keep on keeping on while I'm talking. Oh, this is good. I won't move on just yet. Thank you, Emily. Sorry if I'm saying it wrong. But this person asked, can you talk a bit about the ways that these campaigns may have differed in the North and the South? Also, can you speak on any cultural and systemic campaigns that have implemented since the turn of the 21st century? So I honestly want to start there. I was like, okay, yeah, this makes sense, but what is basically our versions of this right now? I think that the war on drugs and the war on terrorism are still going. And so that's my first answer as to what's going on in the 21st century. And I also think that the criminalization of gayness and trans is still going on, though it's not, though in the US, it is not illegal to be trans and or gay and or queer. There are definitely, there's definitely systemic oppression that law enforcement enforces and perpetuates. But is there when we think about, 2000s on, is there anything else? I said the war on drugs is still going, the war on terrorism is still going, arguably, the criminalization of gayness and transness. Anything else that people want to uplift in this time that I may be missing? Definitely mass incarceration. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Immigration at ICE. Most definitely. But I think mass incarceration, it depends on how we think of mass incarceration. I would think that when I think of mass incarceration, I think about, our current prison system, and I think about how, it has more than doubled since the 80s. And that's what we mean by mass incarceration. Of course, overwhelming majority of those people that have contributed to that doubling is Black men, and very closely Black women. yeah, I think about, so yeah, that's what I think about when I think about mass incarceration, like the rapidness of growth in our prisons that we've seen in the past 30-ish to 40 years. And also immigration and policing have such a long interconnected history. And that's something that y'all can definitely get some real good from Felicia, who will be doing that session in a few weeks. But, you know, policing and migration have, you know, that history starts from the jump, from the beginning, from the top slide. And it's very interesting to see how that has adapted and morphed, and, you know, who's a migrant and what migrants are worthy and who, you know, all of that, and how it looks now in 2020. Okay, I'm gonna move on because I want to make sure we get to talk about the prison industrial complex. But thank y'all for being so participatory. Yeah, and that's kind of what we were just talking about, the state of things. So, what has the history of policing given us? It has given us the prison industrial complex. And this this definition is definitely from critical resistance as well. And it simply says the overlapping interest of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political issues. I actually really like this definition. You know, that, like, I find that social justice oriented definitions can be very, but still hit the nail on the head. But then you find that one that's just, and I think that this really doesn't. I think that one part that's really important and really trying to conceptualize the prison industrial complex is that, you know, that the use of surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political issues. So, you know, real quick in the chat, what are some social, economic, and political issues of our time in our communities? You don't even have to think broad. You can think about your people. What are some, and it's always good to speak from your experience, but what are some economic, social, or political issues that we are facing in our communities that police think is a good idea to solve by surveillance, policing, and imprisonment? Homelessness, yeah. Voter suppression, or just voting access, right? Healthcare disparities, right? There's a reason why a prominent percentage of our prison population are people who are struggling mentally. There's also a reason why a majority of visible homeless people, because homelessness and being displaced is a spectrum within itself. People that you see, a majority of those people are struggling mentally. There's a reason for that. And there's a reason why the police, you know, at least in my perception, usually doesn't offer any real solutions for them, except for like telling them they can't be on this corner, that they gotta move to the next corner, to tell them that they bothering these people, so they gotta move on, like to just basically keep shuffling them around. People are uplifting drugs. Oh, sorry, y'all. All right, I tried going by my house. We're living in real time. But yeah, drugs. The police and the medical industry, but we're not on them right now. The police have definitely, you know, played their part in what is considered a drug. if a drug is considered, who is punished and who is not, how long that person is punished, and the fact that it is valid to punish a person for drug usage in the first place. Hey Ty, lifting up school safety, right? So when we think about the issue of school safety, we think that, you know, more cameras, more police in our schools, and more accountability. That's not really accountability for harm in our schools, being more congruent of what policing looks like than real restorative justice. Yeah, who wants to type up a little bit about digital jail? I think I know what this topic, I think I know what you're talking about, but I don't want to make any assumptions. I'm thinking, is it digital jail like when you know, when you are basically locked out of your social media account because of something that you said? Or are we talking about something different? Okay, I'm sure the answer will come. I'm gonna move on. But thank y'all. Thank y'all for thinking about the ways in which, you know, real life problems that we're struggling with in our community that are ultimately have strong ties to the state. Like a lot of our communities are ultimately, you know, struggling through these problems because of disenfranchisement and state sanctioned violence that is then like a revolving door solutions given by that same state. It's punitive, it's punishment, it's surveillance, it's policing. So we just want to look at this quick clip around Mary Hooks, who is the current director of SONG, Southerners on New Ground.
Immediately I think of a web, mechanisms and systems and rules and policies and institutions and players.
Now I just want to pause right quick because I want to make sure it's actually playing. Can people hear it? And then I'm gonna start it over. Oh, cool. Thank you, Mary. Thank y'all. A bit lagging, that's all right. Listen to the words, that's what's most important. Although Mary is a beautiful person.
Immediately I think of a web, a huge web, and I think of booby traps, and I think of all the different ways and mechanisms and systems and rules and policies and institutions and players that benefit off the suffering of our people and our people being pushed in cages. And everybody who's benefiting off of it and the way our people are suffering inside of cages. It feels like all roads lead to a cage in this country, whether that's from the hospital to a cage, from schools to a cage, from the grocery store to a cage, that we just live in a police state that there is no social safety net to catch our people. And the only thing that, not our people have, but what has been created in order to continue to oppress our people is the prison industrial complex.
Nice. So I think this is a really, short but sweet clip of someone giving their own definition of, the prison industrial complex without, a very formulated, jargon, not formal definition that's going to be like in the pamphlet, like this is what how it feels in my body. This is what it means to me and how I see it show up in my communities. And some of her key comparisons was a web, um, like a web full of like, you know, deception, basically deception and like booby traps and tricks, which I thought it was not only to draw the comparison or to help people envision like a web, something that's complicated to, you know, comprehend, to figure out, but it also has deception in it at the same time, right? So it's like a maze that you cannot win. Oh, that's my comparison. And I think that another way that she artistically said was like you know, like roads all leading to cages. Roads in which all of them lead to cages. And I'm also a creative. I'm an artist. And I'm wondering, like, when you think of it in your brain in that way, when you think of the prison industrial complex and all of its complexities, as though, you know, the word alludes to, what do you envision it to look like? Right? How do you conceptualize it in your mind, all of the moving and different nuanced parts? Is it like a web to you? What would you compare it to and why? Come on, y'all. Yeah, trying to fight vampires and zombies at the same time. I feel like I can just about guess what you meant by that. And I think about the characteristics of the two. Because vampires only come out at night, traditionally. And zombies are like relentless, right? They're just thirsting for blood. Somebody said the maze comparison, one wrong turn and you're trapped. Someone says a door that is always open for you to enter and locks you inside as soon as you get in, and you can't unlock to get out. Ooh. It feels like a massive hunk of Swiss cheese. Some people, mostly Black folks, can fall or be pushed down the holes of the cheese while others just skim on by or dodge the potholes. Oh, y'all excited me. I love this. Whew. Somebody said a black hole, like people just disappear. All right, now y'all tugging on my heartstrings. A soundless place. A burning house. Some don't make it out, some do. Even if you got out though, you can still smell the smoke off you. Oh. You can still smell the smoke off you. Might even carry some burns. Being forced into a widely accepted lower social status. Right? It's like wow, I really like that one. It's like a party you didn't want to be invited to. It's like, oh, you know, just speaking for myself, I know what it's like that on average when I go out, I am being disproportionately policed in some way or other than non-Black people. I'm aware of that. Even if it's something that's not, even if it's a subconscious thing. When asked what was some of my, sometimes the icebreaker has been some of my first experiences of being policed. And what my first experience was hanging outside. And I remember in rural North Carolina, I grew up in rural North Carolina. I remember that in this rural city, with nothing going on. I remember we used to be outside, just hanging out. And the police used to park across the street, like at the convenience store, and just watch us. I think about that so much now, and just watch us, and did it regularly. And we didn't think deeply about it, but we used to say stuff like, and they always over there watching us like we about to do something, you know? And, at the end of the day, it was like low income Black kids that there to be outside on the sidewalk, probably loud because we were having fun. And just if too many of us get together, then something has bound to happen, right? So, thinking about that kind of widely accepted lower social status, that club, that, no one asked to be a part of. Yeah, that was a good one. That was a good one. Thank y'all. Y'all have been so participatory. I really appreciate y'all. And so Black women will continue to help us. We have just a few more minutes. I'm like, ooh, I kind of ran out of time. What video are we going to discuss? But I think that maybe get into the nuance and make sure that we, I want to go back. Sorry, I'm having I don't know if y'all can hear me or not. My computer kind of froze. Okay, here we go. Oh, good, thank y'all. So I think we'll do this one, and I'll keep my talking short so that we can actually watch it. But I think to keep on defining prison industrial complex for us to, share with each other the different ways that it shows up in our lives, and to think about kind of a lot of the things that we brought up, and I think a lot of the things that are brought up in the defund police movement is many components, right? But I think a prominent component is the police have taken over like wellness, to generally speak. The police have taken over wellness. The fact that, they are the first responders to mental health crises. The fact that police are involved in our housing. What I mean by that is like, that's who comes to get you if you're not paying, you can't afford to pay your rent. The fact that policing have to do with, or, different like social control law enforcement of like who can have housing, you can't have, if your significant other is a man, it can be in your public housing, just like all type of ways in which like law enforcement, and the spectrum of it is wrapped up in our mental health access, our housing, our food, and food is anywhere from like SNAP to the practice of police officers being in low income grocery stores are in low income neighborhoods, like how they have really just been in every component of wellness, has been, a detriment to our people. And so I'll leave us with this.
underlying the prison industrial complex, there's been a consistency. And the consistency has been to target vulnerable people. And the definition of vulnerable has some variation over time and space. And we can see greater intensities in certain kinds of places and lesser in others. So for example, modestly educated people in the prime of life who are not white been targeted significantly, but so have white people, especially but not exclusively in rural America. People not documented to work have been targeted, but so have people who have been documented not to work, which is, say, people who have been carrying convictions regardless of their citizenship status. But what's also key to my understanding of what's going on now is the fact that police departments, or what they like to call themselves, police organizations, over time have gotten greater and greater power to participate in many aspects of social life that other state agencies used to take care of. In other words, police organizations, especially in big cities, here in New York City, in the city of Los Angeles, and we could probably name many, many others, have internalized the mission of social welfare organizations. And the difference between what they do and what these other state agencies has done or have done is that they demand a certain kind of self-policing or unbadged deputy status in order for people to qualify for meager social goods and benefits. At the same time, agencies whose mission has never been about policing and punishment, let's say the United States Department of Education, or any number of welfare and other agencies, health, for example, have internalized the mission of policing in order to allocate the scarce resources that they have between the so-called deserving and the undeserving. So one case in point that I like to use as an example is the United States Department of Education has a SWAT team. Why would they have a SWAT team? To legitimize what they do in the eyes of the completely delegitimized and yet still large set of agencies whose work is supposed to be social welfare, social goods, social benefits, and, dare I say, social justice.
Right. So that gives us a little bit to think about in the many ways, the prison industrial complex, we can literally, each part of it could be its own webinar, whether we're talking about kind of like the wellness component that we've been elaborating on at the end of our time, whether we talked about, and it's really, when we talk about the PIC, it's really, the umbrella for, basically the other parts of our series. And can really, has even, I think that we're still trying to figure out all the complex ways in which it is functioning, and which, some people are benefiting from it, and even, profiting of it, and others are being, squished, killed and brutalized from the weight of it. But when we think about, the other ways, this is just a kind of to ground us in what we're talking about, and how we're committed to talking about it. But that's all that I have for us. And for, we're a little over time, but we did start a little late, so we can take, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes tops, for some Q&A. So I want to direct you to also to get some streamlining and to make sure that I get everyone's question and that it is broadcast it in the best way. We're going to use the Q&A function. And so, am I doing it right? If someone could assist me.
I mean, folks can just actually put questions into the Q&A on their end. I think right now there's only one question in there about the North and South campaigns, but I think most folks have been dropping their questions into the chat as well.
Yeah. Okay, that's what. Yeah, I didn't know if I confused anybody asking people questions in the chat. I'm sorry if that was confusing. Now, how do I? I'll go back to this. But yeah, was the question about how maybe those campaigns were different in the North and the South? I'm trying to figure out how to go back. I'm trying to get back. And honestly, I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing. Honestly, I don't even answer that question. I could, with my knowledge, I could assume that it was different, different cultural initiatives were used versus, correlating with what the region was given. But concrete answers, I don't know. But I'm wondering if, anybody in this space has the answer, because I don't have all the answers. I can't get back. I'm trying to. All right, y'all see me struggle. I'm trying to get back to the chat so I can see what folks are saying.
Femi, we also have two other questions. One from Toby, which is, in the 1960s, the Black Panthers policed the police in California. Are there similar efforts underway now? And then Jenna also has a question. Do you have some particular places you would encourage allies to follow, be a part of? Plugging y'all's websites and resources, of course, or anything else. Thanks for what you're doing, so I appreciate y'all. So thanks for that. I don't know, Femi, if you want to jump in with those first, and then if other folks, myself or Blue, also have some input, we can do that too.
Yeah, the first question was around was it the Black Panther Party? I found the chat. The Black Panther Party was doing some policing of the police, and what basically was that, what's going on with that in its current form and our current struggle? And that's a really good question. I think that we actually have a webinar on that. A webinar on different formations of community oversight that are happening in North Carolina, sharing their work. Actually, some people who will be leading that are in the building. Shout out to, Raleigh Pack, Fayetteville Pack, and some other community initiatives will be joining us to talk about people experimenting with police accountability, police review boards, police oversight boards, policing the police type of initiatives and things on the spectrum. So be sure to look out for that webinar. And if anybody else have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add is that I think not in the exact sort of way, but we do have some folks who are doing some more sort of experiments around cop watch programs, which is more of sort of a national model. We do have a few of those around the state where people have been doing that. And a few different collectives who will be presenting throughout the series about their alternatives to policing. One of the things we also just started, at least at NC SPAN, is some other detailed research. So trying to compile in one sort of standalone place where we'd be able to make sure that folks have access to complaints if they're publicly available for your police departments, information about quote unquote problem cops, which obviously this whole series is about the whole entire system is problematic. But if you're sort of invested or really thinking about those law enforcement agents that have many infractions against them or complaints, then we're trying to figure out the best way to pull that together for folks too. And then some of the other work that folks are interested in is also thinking about making one sort of central location for just police violence and police when people have been murdered by the police as well. So if you sort of check back in, we're sort of in formation of that. We're also looking for volunteers to help with that research too. So always welcome y'all to drop us a note too. I think I dropped my email address or the email address that we check for NC SPAN on that as well.
Thank you, Felicia. That was great. I'm also catching what's going on in the chat. Somebody's uplifting Siembra, Siembra of NC, based out of Alamance County for folks who may not be familiar. Their Solidarity Committee does ICE Watch trainings. So I'm sure that if you're not following Siembra via social media, or want to check out their website.
I also want to say that on that point, we also want to make sure that folks are not sort of separating ICE from other types of law enforcement watching, because we don't want to get into the habit of thinking that those things are different because they are part of the same system. So I also want to make sure that we're just focusing that these things need to be in collaboration with other types of groups that are doing accountability work on the broader prison industrial complex as well.
Oh, that's such a good point. Thank you for that. Because I mean, that is a struggle within our current struggle against law enforcement, is that there's a split between, you know, ICE initiatives and, you know, police initiatives when they are very deeply interlocked systems of law enforcement and control. What else? Oh, review boards in North Carolina have no authority because of law by NCGA. I don't know much about that, but I'm curious and want to know. So I'll be looking into that.
And on that point too, both Toby and Suzanne, I think you both raised that, that as far as the review boards, we will have a session later on that will discuss how people are visioning review boards as like a step to other types of sort of oversight. So not as necessarily the end goal of their campaigns, but just sort of one piece of that. So I believe that's in about 2 weeks or so. And we do have a few folks on who I think are still participating that have led those efforts in their local cities. Yes, the Durham Civilian Review Board, a lot of sort of controversy around that particular review board. And just sort of like what they're able to do, right? So we do typically say that review boards have limitations, but folks are really trying to push on how do we sort of make those broader, the authority broader, and again, how it's part of a sort of longer strategy that folks have been working on for a while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Since we're wrapping up our time, I want to make sure that all the questions in the Q&A were answered. I think there's one that wasn't really touched on. If I'm correct, I may not be. Okay. Well, I encourage folks to, as I said, at the beginning of our time to join other sessions. And we're having this 2 times a week for the next, over the course of 4 weeks, an 8-part political education series. And so they're Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so the one Thursday will be She Safe, We Safe. And it will be another person from BYP 100, Mariah, who will talk about She Safe, We Safe, and basically talking about policing from a Black queer feminist lens, and what does it mean to basically protect and also build a world where, you know, Black women, girls, femmes, and gender non-conforming people are safe. Unless my comrades, Felicia or Blue, have anything else to say or to remind people, much gratitude for everyone who participated.